7 B-2 stealth bombers just flew halfway around the world and dropped 14 GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrators on Iran's most protected nuclear facilities. And I don't say that lightly. I've spent years around these systems. I've studied strike packages. I've broken down combat operations for a living. And I can tell you with professional certainty that what happened at Fordow and Natanz is not just another news cycle. It's the moment 3 decades of Iranian strategy met the one weapon it was never built to survive. Operation Midnight Hammer just did in real combat what engineers spent 20 years designing on paper. Punch through hundreds of feet of mountain rock and reinforced concrete and detonate inside facilities Iran spent billions of dollars and half its national pride making untouchable. Iran's underground nuclear architecture, the crown jewel of a deterrence strategy 3 decades in the making, has been hit in a way no one thought was operationally possible until it happened. I'm going to walk you through exactly what the GBU-57 is and why it took 20 years to build. Then I'll break down what Iran actually constructed underground and why the world couldn't stop it short of this moment. Then I'll give you a full tactical breakdown of how Operation Midnight Hammer was planned and flown. And I'll close with my honest professional read on what this accomplishes, what it doesn't, and where this goes from here. Let's get into it. To understand why this strike matters, you have to go back to a strategic problem the Pentagon spent 20 years trying to solve. After the Gulf War in 1991, the world watched American precision air power dismantle an entire Iraqi military in weeks. Every adversary of the United States drew the same lesson from that war. Don't leave your most important assets sitting somewhere American aircraft can reach them. And so, a pattern started, one that intelligence agencies tracked with growing concern through the 1990s and 2000s. Countries hostile to the United States started burying their most critical programs. Not a few feet down, hundreds of feet into mountains behind reinforced concrete and rock built to shrug off anything in the American arsenal. North Korea did this with entire branches of its military. Command centers, missile storage, artillery, all pushed underground. Iran watched this playbook and made a generational bet on the same approach. For a long time, the logic worked. If your enemy cannot physically reach your program cannot be destroyed. And if it cannot be destroyed, you hold leverage no matter what sanctions or diplomacy do to you above ground. The weapon that existed before the GBU-57, the GBU-28, was rushed into service during the Gulf War itself. It weighs around 700 pounds and could punch through roughly 100 feet of earth or about 20 feet of reinforced concrete. In 1991, that was revolutionary. By the mid-2000s, Iran had already built around it. Fordow, the facility carved into a mountain near the holy city of Qom, was built at a depth the GBU-28 could not physically reach. That's not a failure of American intelligence. That's Iran reading the spec sheet of the best bunker buster in the world and digging deeper than it could go. So the Pentagon went back to the drawing board and told contractors to close that gap for good. What came out of that effort was the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, and the numbers on this weapon are worth sitting with. 30,000 pounds. That's the total weight of a single bomb, more than 6 times heavier than the older GBU-28. The warhead itself carries roughly 5,300 pounds of high explosive, wrapped in a specialized hardened steel casing engineered to survive the physical violence of slamming into rock and concrete at high speed without breaking apart before it detonates. Publicly available estimates put its penetration capability at up to 200 feet of reinforced concrete, or well over 100 feet into hard rock, before the fusing system triggers the warhead. That fusing system is one of the most sophisticated parts of the entire weapon, and it deserves its own explanation. An underground facility is never just one open room. It's layered. Access tunnels, blast doors, reinforced corridors, and then the hardened inner chambers that actually house the equipment you're trying to destroy. The GBU-57 uses a programmable fuse that can be set to delay detonation for a precise interval after impact, so mission planners can calculate how long it will take the weapon to punch through each layer of material above the target and time the explosion to go off once the warhead is sitting inside the most critical space, not somewhere in the rubble above it. You're not caving in a roof. You are detonating inside the room, and the overpressure generated by more than 5,000 pounds of high explosive going off in a sealed underground chamber is not something reinforced concrete or blast doors are built to absorb. There is no practical construction budget that survives that kind of energy release in a confined space. Only one aircraft in the American inventory can carry this weapon, the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, and even the B-2 can only carry 2 of them per aircraft. That is not a limitation anybody overlooked. It reflects exactly how large and heavy this weapon is, combined with the requirement that whatever carries it survive in contested airspace long enough to deliver it precisely from altitude. You don't send a fighter jet to drop a 30,000-pound bomb. You need long range, a stealth profile, and precision navigation systems, and the B-2 is the only platform in the world built to check every one of those boxes at once. Development of the weapon ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars. And the program was upgraded more than once over the years as intelligence updated estimates of how deep Iran was actually digging. That back and forth between American engineers and Iranian construction crews had been going on quietly for close to 2 decades. Operation Midnight Hammer is the moment that competition got settled in the open, in actual combat, with an actual result on the ground. Now let's talk about what Iran actually built, because most people don't appreciate the scale of it. Iran's underground nuclear infrastructure isn't a single bunker. It's a network built over 3 decades, funded through oil revenue and sustained through sanctions and diplomatic pressure that never fully stopped construction. Fordow is the site that gets the most attention, and it earns that attention. It sits somewhere in the range of 260 to 300 feet inside a mountain near Qom. The world didn't even know it existed until 2009, when Western intelligence agencies working off satellite imagery and human sources exposed the facility publicly. Iran's response at the time was telling. There was no denial. Officials essentially confirmed it existed and said plainly that it was designed to be beyond the reach of a military strike. At the time, given the weapons that existed, that was an accurate statement. Fordow was built to house centrifuge cascades, the machinery that spins uranium toward higher levels of enrichment. The International Atomic Energy Agency documented the site extensively over the years, tracking enrichment levels and flagging violations. But that oversight never translated into the physical destruction of the site's capability, because everyone understood the military option against Fordow was, for a long time, genuinely constrained. Natanz is the other major site, and it's a more complicated picture. It has both above-ground buildings and underground halls, with the underground sections built to a shallower depth than Fordow, which put at least parts of it within reach of older bunker-busting weapons. But it was Fordow that required something more, and it was Fordow that absorbed the bulk of the strike, with reporting indicating 12 of the 14 GBU-57s used in the operation were dropped there, with the remaining 2 hitting an underground portion of Natanz. A third site, the uranium conversion facility at Isfahan, was struck separately. Not with the GBU-57, but with submarine-launched Tomahawk cruise missiles, because that facility's underground component was assessed to sit even deeper than the MOP could reliably reach. I want to be honest here about the limits of what's publicly confirmed, because intellectual honesty matters more than sounding certain when the picture is still developing. In the days immediately after the strike, there was real disagreement inside the U.S. government itself. An early leaked intelligence assessment suggested the damage at Fordow specifically was less severe than initially claimed, which pushed senior defense officials into a public briefing to walk through what they said was updated and higher confidence intelligence pointing to much more significant destruction. Independent satellite imagery analysts and outside experts have offered mixed reads on the extent of the damage, and some regional assessments have suggested Iran's program may have been set back by months rather than years. That range of assessments is worth holding on to rather than picking the most dramatic version and running with it. What is not seriously disputed is that this was the first time the GBU-57 has ever been used in actual combat, that the strike represented the largest employment of that weapon system in history, and that the facilities struck were, until that moment, considered by nearly everyone to be beyond the reach of a conventional strike. Now let's get into the mission itself, because a strike like this does not happen on short notice. The B-2 fleet is based at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, and getting these aircraft to Iran and back required an enormous logistical and planning effort. Reporting on the operation described 7 B-2s flying east toward Iran as the main strike package, while a separate pair of B-2s flew west over the Pacific as a deliberate decoy intended to muddy any picture an adversary might be building of what was actually happening. More than 125 aircraft in total supported the operation, including refueling tankers and fighter escorts tasked with suppressing any Iranian air defenses along the route. According to briefings given after the fact, the lead B-2 dropped the first 2 MOPs on Fordow at around 6:40 in the evening Eastern Time, which was roughly 2 in the morning local time in Iran, and over the following 25 minutes, the rest of the 14 weapons were released across the 2 target areas. A single U.S. Navy submarine in the region launched more than 24 Tomahawk cruise missiles at Isfahan once the bomber strikes were complete. Officials briefing the press afterwards said Iranian fighters never got airborne, and Iranian air defense radar never appears to have detected the strike package at all, meaning the mission retained the element of surprise from beginning to end. A mission like this requires a level of intelligence preparation that goes well beyond a typical strike. You need subsurface geological analysis of exactly what kind of rock and soil sits above the target, because that determines how the weapon behaves on the way down and whether it reaches the intended depth before detonating. You need a structural picture of the facility itself, so planners know where the ventilation shafts are, where the hardened chambers sit, and where the access tunnels run that aren't worth wasting a weapon on. According to accounts from the operation, 6 of the B-2s targeted Fordow's 2 main ventilation shafts directly, with the first bombs blowing the concrete covers off those shafts, and the following weapons driving down through the opening into the facility itself, with one additional weapon per aircraft held in reserve in case of a failure. That is not improvisation. That's the product of a targeting cell working through years of accumulated intelligence on a single facility, calculating fuse timing down to a level of precision that determines whether a 30,000-pound bomb detonates in a hallway or inside the room that actually matters. Let me give you my honest professional read on what this strike accomplished, and where I think the picture is more complicated than a simple victory lap. If the weapon performed as designed and the shockwave generated inside those confined underground chambers reached the levels engineers built it to produce, then the physical infrastructure it hit is not something Iran rebuilds on any short timeline. You do not rapidly reconstitute a facility carved hundreds of feet into a mountain. That is a construction effort measured in years, requiring specialized equipment and materials that are increasingly hard for Iran to source under existing sanctions. If the centrifuge halls and power infrastructure at the core of Fordow were destroyed the way early briefings suggested, that is a real and significant physical setback, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But here's where the honest analysis gets harder, and where I want to be fair rather than triumphant. Destroying a building is not the same as destroying a program. Iran has spent more than 2 decades building a base of nuclear expertise. That means trained physicists, trained engineers, documented processes, and institutional knowledge, none of which lives inside a mountain and none of which a bomb can reach. That knowledge survives the strike. The intent behind the program survives the strike. The open question is how much material and equipment survives along with it. Iran had years, arguably decades, to think through what happens if the option everyone called operationally impossible eventually became possible. And there is genuine uncertainty in the public record about what was moved out of these facilities before the strike and what wasn't. I want to flag that clearly as unconfirmed rather than pretend we know the answer. What we can say with more confidence is that even if some material was relocated in advance, whatever survived did so without the physical protection that made it strategically significant in the first place. The insurance policy is gone, whether or not every asset it was protecting is gone with it. The second effect, and I think this is genuinely the bigger story here, is doctrinal. For 30 years, the underlying logic of underground hardening was treated as sound military doctrine around the world. Dig deep enough, reinforce it well enough, and conventional weapons simply cannot reach you. That logic has now been tested in actual combat rather than a test range, on one of the most fortified nuclear sites on the planet, and the result is public. Every country running a hardened underground program, and there are more of them than most people realize, just watch the United States demonstrate that depth alone is not the guarantee it used to be. That is a strategic ripple effect that extends well beyond Iran's borders, and it changes the calculus for any state weighing whether to bury its most critical programs rather than negotiate over them. Now, the escalation question, because I know it's what a lot of you are actually thinking about. Iran has a well-documented pattern of responding to direct strikes indirectly, through regional proxy networks, missile threats, and pressure on shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. And in the immediate aftermath, Iranian officials publicly reserved the right to retaliate, while parliament reportedly moved to approve steps toward closing the strait. That has historically been a calibrated response, designed to inflict cost without triggering an exchange Iran would clearly lose. But Iran's proxy network has been under sustained pressure for the past couple of years, with real degradation to groups it has relied on for exactly this kind of indirect leverage. I want to be careful here rather than overstate it, because the full extent of that degradation and how quickly Iran can rebuild it is still genuinely being assessed. What's clearer is that the options available to Tehran for an indirect response are narrower than they were even 2 years ago. And a direct missile response against American or Allied territory carries a level of escalation risk that Iranian leadership has historically avoided when the American posture in the region is unmistakably serious. The bottom line here is this. Operation Midnight Hammer and the first combat use of the GBU-57 against Iran's underground nuclear infrastructure is a genuine strategic inflection point, one of the most significant conventional weapons events in decades. Whether the damage at Fordow turns out to be the complete destruction early briefings described or something less total once independent assessments finish their work, the doctrine of protection through depth, the strategic insurance policy Iran spent 30 years and untold billions building, has been tested in real combat for the first time and shown to have real limits. What this strike does not do is resolve the underlying competition. The nuclear ambition, Iran's regional posture, the ideological drivers behind its strategic behavior, none of that was buried in those tunnels. What was tested in those tunnels was Iran's confidence that its program could survive from a position of physical invulnerability, and that confidence has taken a serious hit, regardless of exactly how the final damage assessment settles. Here's what I want to know from you. Do you think the physical damage to these sites changes Iran's nuclear calculus for the long run? Or does a program like this survive as long as the expertise and the political will to rebuild it survive? That's the real question, and I want to hear where this community actually lands on it. If this breakdown gave you something you couldn't get from the headlines, subscribe and turn on notifications, because this is exactly the kind of analysis we do here. No noise, no spin, just a professional read from someone who understands what these decisions actually cost. Stay sharp.